Greetings, everyone. Thank you for watching our presentation of our recent study titled Caregiver Perceptions of Overexcitabilities Among Early Elementary Gifted Learners. My name is Dr. Carrie Guilbault, and I am an Associate Professor of Gifted Education at Johns Hopkins University.
And my name is Dr. Greg Eckert. I am a research assistant at Johns Hopkins University.
Our third co-author for this article is Dr. Antonia Szymanski, who is an associate professor at Western Kentucky University. Literature review. We know that caregivers play an important role in the development of talent in high potential children. However, limited research exists on their observations and perceptions of their child's affective development. This information might aid in the development of parent education programs, counseling services, and instruments that can help adults recognize students who may need adjustments in educational interventions and in parenting. Caregivers can be valuable resources of information regarding their child's early developmental milestones, their interests, and characteristics of advanced ability that can help aid intervention and talent development. We believe that early identification for talent development and psychosocial interventions may also be especially beneficial to advanced learners that come from low income backgrounds or from marginalized populations that have been traditionally underrepresented in advanced learning programs. Early intervention is a strategy that can also be implemented to close excellence gaps. This exploratory study aims to provide new insights into the perceptions of parents of primary grade gifted children by focusing on their observations of their child's intensities, personalities, and social emotional development. This study also aims to contribute to the literature on primary grade intellectually gifted learners, their personality characteristics, and heightened sensitivities, including overexcitabilities. So our study was guided by these two main overarching questions. What are the perceptions of caregivers related to the social and emotional development, personality factors, and OEs among early elementary gifted children as those defined in grades K through 3? What differences, if any, exist between their overexcitability profiles and openness to experience, which is one of the big 5 factor models of personality, according to their level of giftedness, age, and gender? So we first conducted a review of the literature on a few key related topics, including the social emotional characteristics of gifted children, including the highly and profoundly gifted learners. We also looked at research on parent or caregivers' observation of gifted traits of young children. We reviewed literature on overexcitabilities and overexcitability instruments, as well as the big 5 and especially openness to experience. So we found from literature that many gifted children experience asynchronous development, which is an uneven development between cognitive, affective, and physical ability. Some experts feel that this asynchronous development is a defining characteristic of high intelligence and should therefore be included in the definitions of intelligence. In general, there is consensus that intellectually gifted students are actually socially and emotionally well-adjusted, although their advanced abilities may create some unique challenges when it comes to same-age peers and the environment. Gifted children are also sometimes characterized by their sensitivities or intensities, sometimes termed overexcitabilities. Although there are varying definitions of gifted or giftedness, for our study, we really focused on including students that were identified as intellectually gifted. So intellectual giftedness, as we know, exists on a continuum from the mildly to the profoundly gifted. The research tells us that highly gifted and profoundly gifted learners, those children that are, 3, 4, or more standard deviations above the norm, that they have been described in the literature as outliers with unique social emotional development patterns who could be at particular risk of social isolation and some unique social emotional challenges, especially during the preschool, the early childhood years, according to Morawska Gross. Lena Hollingworth warned us that this population may be at risk of social and emotional difficulties, such as social isolation, even compared to their moderately gifted peers. In 93, Morawska Gross's study, she clarified that these difficulties that have been described, they result from this lack of access to true cognitive peers. It's not something that's inherently wrong with the profoundly gifted learner. It's more of the context of them not being with others who are like them. She found that the gifted tend to seek out those with similar cognitive abilities as friends in their friendships. And we also know that highly and profoundly gifted learners have been described by their parents and their teachers as showing unusual awareness for philosophical, moral, and existential concerns at a much earlier age than is typical. However, further research is needed to provide empirical evidence to support some of these claims and anecdotes. So researchers have investigated the influence of parenting styles on the development of talent. They've also researched parents' perceptions of giftedness and their roles in the referral process, and their satisfaction with schooling and gifted programming. We know from the literature that caregivers may be valuable sources of information. They can tell us about their child's early developmental milestones. They're the ones who spend the most amount of time with them in those early years, so they are keenly aware of their child's, deep interests and passions and other characteristics of advanced ability that we can use to help aid earlier intervention and talent development. In many studies, parents reliably reported gifted characteristics of their preschool children. Frequent responses that they would often give on studies that included checklists, for example, include having large vocabularies, early reading ability without direct instruction, as well as persistence on complex tasks and having excellent memories. Finally, we reviewed the literature on overexcitabilities and the big five personality factors, especially openness to experience. According to Kazimierz Dabrowski, overexcitabilities, as many of you are aware, are these innate intensities that indicate heightened response to stimuli. He proposed 5 overexcitabilities: intellectual, imaginational, emotional, psychomotor, and sensual. The 5-factor model, or the big 5 factor of personality development, is a very well-known taxonomy of personality traits. It includes facets such as openness to experience, neuroticism, conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness. We can't go into great detail of those in this presentation, but we have a manuscript that is coming out in publication that we hope that many of you will read, and you can feel free to contact us for further information. A few recent studies have started to explore that relationship between overexcitabilities and the personality traits, the 5-factor model, and openness to experience. For instance, Dr. Sheila Gallagher's 2022 study compared openness to experience and overexcitabilities in highly gifted middle school students, and she found that openness to experience enhances intelligence. So in her study, she proposed that young students who are more open to experience may exhibit more curiosity in the world around them. And then similarly, as individuals seek out these new experiences, they tend to increase their knowledge base. In describing the difference between openness to experience, or OTE, and overexcitabilities, Gallagher noted, everyone is represented somewhere on an openness to experience scale. In contrast, an overexcitability is an extreme. Having overexcitability is an outlier experience. The difference between openness to experience and overexcitabilities is comparable to the difference between generalized intelligence and giftedness. So to briefly give you an overview of the methods for this particular study, the present study followed a mixed methods explanatory sequential design. In this study, questionnaires and semi-structured interviews were used to collect both qualitative and quantitative data. Participants first completed questionnaires, and then they were then interviewed to gain deeper insight. So we felt that this approach was best suited for this exploratory study because it allowed us to continuously compare data and conduct member checking with our participants. So each participant completed 2 valid and reliable surveys. They were completed online. The first was the LMN-OE, which is by Bouchard. And this is a measure, it measures Dabrowski's 5 overexcitabilities for elementary school students under the age of 13. So it's a Likert scale with 30 items, and it is, as I said, valid and reliable. The second instrument that we used was the BFQC, or the Big 5 Questionnaire Children Form by Barbara Nelly. And this one measures personality factors in children. This instrument contains 65 items, and it is one of the more commonly used instruments for evaluating personality factors, specifically in children. So again, you can reach out to us if you'd like more information on either of these instruments. There are, of course, some other tools that do exist and that are commonly used for measuring overexcitabilities in the research, such as the OEQ2, the Overexcitabilities Questionnaire 2. scale, but we sought a free instrument that was normed to be used with children as young as age 4, because one of the outcomes we also hope to update and revise that element OE scale in a future study. So the participants for this study, it consisted of a purposive sample of 11 caregivers of 11 intellectually gifted children between the ages of 5 and 9 that resided in the United States. These ages were selected for our study because we really wanted to speak with caregivers of younger students that would be able to easily recall those early childhood milestones and behaviors more clearly than parents of older students. And then also because we wanted to use this exploratory data to revise the element OE instrument for students in grades K to 2. So we recruited participants through national gifted associations and referrals from professionals that work with young gifted learners. And the only eligibility criteria was that the student had already been formally identified as intellectually gifted, either by their school professionals or through private testing, and then also that they were between the ages of 5 and 9 years old. As you can see here, our caregiver participants were predominantly female and white, those that responded and that were interested in being interviewed and participating in the study. The children of the participants ranged in ages, again, from 5 to 9. 3 of the children spoke at least one language other than English at home. We collected data regarding their reported level of giftedness based on standardized individual IQ tests, group ability tests, or achievement tests that the parents had access to. And the caregivers reported that there were a variety of scales that had been used by the private psychologist or school staff to evaluate their children for gifted program eligibility. And some of those included the COGAT, the WISC, 5th edition, and MAP, are the measures of academic progress. So our data analysis looked like this. We started with the qualitative and quantitative. We had the survey, 2 surveys, interviews using member checking to make sure that there wasn't anything that we miscaptured or that needed to be clarified or corrected. And then our analysis of our qualitative data through inductive thematic analysis, and then a little bit more statistical analyses that my colleague, Dr. Eckert, will share when he shares results of the quantitative data. So for the results of this study, so our findings that aligned with the research question number 1 from the qualitative data yielded 2 primary themes. The first theme we called sensitivities and intensities, and the second one is behaviors associated with challenges at home and at school. The first theme that we identified from the data is the concept of this deep emotional sensitivities and intensities. We divided this into 4 sub-themes that emerged, as you can see here on the left. And each of these sub-themes were connected and related to some specific overexcitabilities. So you can see on the right, SOE stands for sexual overexcitability, emotional overexcitability, and intellectual overexcitability. So some of the examples from our data you can see in the middle column, and then some sample quotes are on the right. If you'd like to pause the presentation, you can read those in a little bit more detail. But some of the things that really kind of stood out to us were the frequency that responses such as this intense sense of justice. So children becoming very, very upset over things that they perceive to be unfair. They had this real strong sense of right from wrong. Some other things were their desire to really take action over issues that seem to bother them, in their local communities or the world at large, which for very, very young children, that's kind of difficult because their life experiences might not match and they might not have access to be able to do a lot of these things. So it was something that really drove them. And so that was another thing that really stood out to us. The second theme that emerged was related to student behaviors that resulted in challenges either at home or at school or both. And under this theme, we identified 4 sub-themes that you can see here on the left. And then these again overlap with each one of them overlaps with at least one overexcitability. So we've coded these on the right. Some examples of these themes you can see on this thematic matrix chart. So this desire, this strong need for control and autonomy, they really wanted to be in charge of themselves. They wanted to have this autonomy. They wanted to make decisions, be treated like an older child or an adult. So a lot of times the parents describe, it's sort of like a 50-year-old man in a 8-year-old's body. They would talk and prefer to talk with older children or adults, but they also, they felt like people should be speaking to them and related to them more as an adult than as a young child. Motivation, relationships, and transitions. Transitions was something that came up quite frequently, the having difficulty with transitions because they become so engrossed in an activity that, if they were at school, for instance, and, now the bell was ringing or it was time to switch and go from math to science, they had a really hard time stopping those activities and going on to the next thing because they were so engrossed they wanted to continue, which could cause, challenges with their teachers or the classroom. And related to this was often struggling with having time limits imposed. And so you can see on the right some sample quotes from our parent interviews. And next, Dr. Eckert is going to share with you some results from our surveys.
Great, thank you. So transitioning now to our survey data, results from parent responses on 2 questionnaires, the LMNOE and the BFQC, were analyzed using descriptive statistics and measures of central tendency, followed by a correlation matrix to identify possible relationships between mean scores for open to experience and the 5 overexcitabilities. To recall, our first research question was, what are the perceptions of caregivers related to social emotional development, personality factors, and overexcitabilities among early elementary gifted children in grades K through 3. Next. First, we ran descriptive statistics in SPSS for the LMNOE survey, which ranged from 3 to 11 questions for the 5 overexcitabilities. The highest mean score was for emotional OE with a mean of 4.44, followed by intellectual OE with a mean score of 4.35, whereas the 2 lowest mean scores were for sensual OE, which was 3.82, and imaginational OE, which was 4.00, as displayed here. We also ran descriptive statistics for the BFQC survey, which contains subscales for each one of the big 5 personality factors. Mean scores were calculated for each factor. The factor with the highest mean score, as seen in this table, was open to experience with a mean score of 4.22, and the factor with the lowest mean score was conscientiousness, which was a mean of 3.36. As you can see here, the data displays a correlation matrix that was used to identify the relationship between the average scores for open to experience and the average scores for each of the 5 overexcitabilities. The correlation matrix revealed a positive significant correlation in 3 areas between open to experience and 5 OEs. So the first was intellectual and OTE, OTE and sensual, and OTE and imagination. The correlation matrix also identified a relationship between 2 of the Dabrowskian OEs, emotional OE and sensual OE. Although these correlations were significant, they were relatively weak. So now transitioning to our second research question, what differences, if any, exist between OE profiles and openness to experience according to the student's level of giftedness, age, and gender? To explore this research question, we first use a hierarchical cluster analysis to determine if the data could be summarized in a meaningful way that shows similarities among participants as well as any differences. And after examining the hierarchical cluster analysis dendrogram, we had just agreed that the cutting height created 2 distinct clusters. As a follow-up analysis, a k-means cluster analysis was run to observe the final cluster centers, as shown on the table on the left, which displays the mean scores for openness to experience and OEs for the participants who fell into the 2 clusters identified during the cluster analysis. A k-means final cluster was used to calculate the mean scores of participants in the areas of openness to experience as well as the OEs. Students in cluster 1, which consisted of 5 students, fell into the mildly to moderately gifted ranges. Cluster 2, which consisted of 6 students, fell into the highly to profoundly gifted ranges, as well as 3 moderately gifted students. The mean scores in all 5 OEs and openness to experience are lower for students in cluster 1 when compared to cluster 2. Within the final cluster centers, participants in cluster 2 scored higher across all 5 OEs and openness to experience.
So our two overarching themes that were highlighted from the voices of caregivers of young gifted children were sensitivities and intensities and behaviors associated with challenges at home and school. So these themes provide insight into the traits and characteristics that might be observable during primary years. And we found that they did align with previous findings from other research on gifted children and overexcitabilities. Our findings also align with previous studies suggesting that parents are a reliable source of information and insight regarding gifted characteristics. Our survey results illustrate possible gifted profiles and common traits that should be explored further. Information can be used to update the LMNOE instrument for use in the primary grades. A few other key findings here to discuss are that in relation to the social emotional characteristics, parents in this study identified traits in line with literature such as asynchronous development, a strong sense of justice, empathy, deep emotional sensitivity, and an awareness and concern for global and environmental issues. Each subtheme was also related to several of Dabrowski's overexcitabilities and TPD. For instance, concern with global issues, existential questions, and the strong sense of justice, sometimes leading to action, was very similar to what Dabrowski referred to as positive maladjustment, meaning not compromising one's ideas and having the fortitude to stand alone. Another subtheme related to challenges at home and school was described as this intense need for control and autonomy, sometimes displayed or perceived as noncompliance, which may be related to what Bukowski calls resistance to compulsion. Another subtheme illustrated in the children's strong response to stimuli, and the interviews also revealed that behaviors that are commonly found in children that might be diagnosed with various learning differences or disabilities, such as those connections between OE and autism or ADHD, found also in the work by Bukowski and Wells and Falk. A few parents did mention that their child had either a 504 plan or an IEP, individualized education plan, or that they were in the process of being tested for learning disabilities. And we thought that maybe since the participants' children were in those very early grades and their experiences were disrupted because of the COVID-19 pandemic, so that in-person schooling was really interrupted, this relationship between OEs and learning differences should be further investigated, because there may be something there, since so many parents did report related to that. Most of these social emotional characteristics were seen as generally positive by caregivers. So they describe their child's concern for others as evidence of leadership, of compassion, and kindness. But on the other hand, they express concern for their young gifted child's difficulties in emotional regulation, managing frustration, which sometimes led to oppositional behaviors or withdrawal. And they did typically result in some kind of conflicts or trouble at school. So again, similar to previous studies, anxiety, worry, stress, and fear of the unknown, fear of death, they were frequently cited by caregivers as some other concerns, and they do suggest that parenting young gifted children may bring with it unique challenges.
So there are several limitations to the present study. First, this is an exploratory study, and it used a purposive sample of parents who were interested in sharing their stories. Selection bias may be reflected in that sample. It is also important to note that caregivers who volunteered for this study were members of gifted support networks. It is possible they sought out organizations, therapists, or gifted parent groups because they were seeking assistance or guidance. Therefore, their experiences may be unique. Second, although efforts were made to recruit families from different backgrounds, cultures, and ethnic groups, the sample consisted mainly of mothers and was limited in racial and ethnic diversity. A third limitation is the use of self-reporting of levels of giftedness and the fact that children had not all been administered the same assessments for comparison and clear categorization into the levels of giftedness. Finally, some researchers suggest that personality is less fixed in very young children, and therefore may pose some problems with the use of specific instruments. We selected the LMNOE instrument and the BFQC for this reason, since other commonly used OE instruments are norm for children over the age of 12 or even adults. This study considered the crucial role of caregivers' observations and perceptions of their young gifted learners, an area that is ripe for research within gifted education. During the semi-structured interviews, parents communicated about sensitivities and intensities that often acted as barriers to their child's learning. Further, parents discussed behaviors associated with challenges at home and school. These interviews call attention to the valuable insight parents bring to research within the field of gifted education, especially with primary school-age children. Findings from the LMOE suggest additional items may be necessary to capture the full range of characteristics and behaviors displayed by young gifted children. While this exploratory study contains a small sample size, the findings are an important step with identifying students who may need adjustments in educational planning and parenting. The findings of this exploratory study are important for those in the field to consider. Including caregivers as informants may add to the provision of appropriate teaching strategies and aid in the talent identification process, providing observations of behaviors that are not exhibited in school. Results can also be used by both counselors and educators to plan informational sessions for caregivers and other service providers on the social emotional characteristics and behaviors that are common in gifted children during their early school years. Cultivating the relationship between families and schools sends the message that parents, caregivers, and teachers are united in their support of student learning and developing their potential. So moving on to our selected references, feel free to pause this recording if you want to take a picture or copy these selected references from our study. And our final slide, this is our contact information. Please reach out to us if you have any questions at all about our study. Also, please keep an eye out for our article in Roper Review, which has been accepted for publication. If you would like to read this again, feel free to reach out to us and let us know. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much.